Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast.
A community of amazing people who love talking about and sharing their love of the details behind making games.
Whether or not they're actually based in London. I'm Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns.
And I'm Alyx, she, her pronouns. And we're beta testing a new format today for a regular chat between hosts where we can talk about the pressing topics of the moment.
So, what are we going to talk about today? I think there is one pressing topic that everyone is talking about. Go on, Alyx, tell us, what is that topic?
Yeah, it's not the most positive thing, but it is the layoffs in the games industry. And we've seen, a sad, huge amount of them.
Yeah.
But I thought we'd start off by talking about what we actually mean by layoffs, because some people might not be aware, and it's happening globally. So, Oscar, what does that mean to you?
Well, as someone who has been made redundant 3 times in my career, and also has had to make a large number of people redundant in various circumstances, it's an emotionally difficult time, and it can be caused by a number of things. The most positive way I think of is the particular project you are working on or the organisation that you're in will sometimes hit a brick wall. The thesis, the concept, the principle of what they were trying to do with the team that they originally had has stopped working. And as a result, they have to make some really hard decisions. And those hard decisions often fall on the brunt of the people who were doing the job. Sometimes we know, and again, you have personal experience with this as well. Sometimes we know that it's come as a result of over excitement, over prepping, and then a failure of managerial planning that would then lead to having to make cuts. That's not always the case. There are circumstances where it's a lot less cynical than that, but also, I think the current circumstances, we'll get into that later, the current circumstances are really interesting, where you have a juxtaposition of numerous issues. For example, a loss of project or whatever. That's why I think it's really interesting to talk about it as a thesis has not worked or has run out of time. You have to do something else, and what's the best thing to do? And I think a clean, simple step out from that is great, but the human collateral of that can't be underestimated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And it's not just full-time employees, it can affect freelancers as well, because they'll suddenly be pulled off projects and lose income, and they're not even talked about in the same way, because there's not like a clear-cut, this is the end of your work now.
No, first people to go often are the consultants, the freelancers, because on the balance sheet, they're the most obvious ones that you have least commitment to. There is a contractual commitment. The contractual commitment has an endpoint. No, don't get me wrong. Not everyone's a good guy in the process. I'm not trying to suggest otherwise. But I think most people who are trying to do their best get into the circumstances where the world around them has changed and they have to make a tough call. And I think the respect, I'll give you an example, right? So we were at one of the telecom companies. This was Three, the telecom company. This is in the early days when we just launched, and that organisation was having a really big shift between building a network to the running a network. The net result of that is massive changes happen, and my boss at the time said to me, "I'm going." He had volunteered to go himself, and he was the one doing all the redundancies to his team. I was okay on that particular round, but it's interesting when I have such respect for him, because he took it on the chin. He realised what was necessary to do. He was going to be fine. I know he was going to be fine. He was talented, capable, and hopefully you can tell from what I'm saying, emotionally, relevant person. But there were not everybody going through that process had the luxury of having such a positive-minded person. So like I say, I've been on all of the sides of the fence of this myself. Like I say, you've been through this recently as well. And I'm sure you have different stories, and obviously we're not going to get into like whys and wherefores and point fingers at people, whatever. I know you can do it anyway, but
of course, never.
No, never. Later. later. We talk about it later. Anyway, but yeah, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think, well, initially we get told like your role's at risk of redundancy, and I don't know if layoff's a term that's used more in America or it's quite a broad term, because I think initially I hadn't gone, oh, that's the same thing that's happening right now.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it kind of means the same thing as redundancy.
Yeah, it's kind of a slang. I mean, layoffs, redundancy. I mean, redundancy is the official term, and there's legal elements to that. You can be laid off as a colloquialism by just losing a job for some purpose, but in the UK, I believe, or Europe in general, the regulations about what you can do as an employer to ask someone to leave is more restrictive than in the US. The amount of notice you're required to give, the amount of pay you're required to give. Honestly, I do not understand how the US market operates with such little employee protection, particularly given that. And I'd love to know if there's people out there who worked in the US and how they've dealt with it. But it strikes me that you do get paid slightly more, but you're taxed quite heavily, as heavily as Europe in general. And there's this illusion that US people don't get taxed as much, but I think the numbers actually say the other way round. But I'd love to know what US people do and how they deal with it, particularly around healthcare. Because your employment leads to your healthcare, I suspect it's quite a traumatic process. Not that it's not traumatic for us too. I mean, don't get me wrong. Although there has been, I'm going to go off on one now, aren't I? I said I don't talk all the time.
Go on, go for it.
The irony is, when I got made redundant at Sony, because they would decide they weren't going to continue PlayStation Home on PS4, and completely, thesis come to an end.
Yeah.
I was excited. Now, I mean, this is probably unfair. If you're out there and you're feeling sad, don't take this the wrong way. I don't mean this in a bad way. This is the third time I'd been made redundant. This is the first time I was working for a big company, and the big company gave me enough to keep going and do something new, try something new. And I wasn't able, during my employment at Sony, to make my own games. I wouldn't have been able. I mean, yes, the Rocky Horror Show game failed, but I wouldn't have been able to try to do that if I hadn't had that redundancy. So, whilst it's a terribly thing for lots of people, for some people, it can become a moment of massive opportunity. And I think that it's important to talk about that too, not to underestimate the pain and the sadness and the fear that goes with that. But for some of us, we get these moments in time when magic can happen only because that's happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's possible to experience those things in duality as well. I found the whole process incredibly painful, and I was angry and upset, and you go through this constant, like, I would say it's almost similar to grief, especially if it's a company and place that you loved. Yeah. And it's kind of similar to breaking up with someone and all the emotions you go through. Completely. And then having to look at your colleagues going out for dinners or having fun things, and you're just like, I want to be part of that. What did I do? Those kind of feelings. But equally, like, oh, I'm setting up my own game studio. I can make the game that I've always really wanted to, and I can do that full time now. That's all really exciting. Yeah. And then I literally got chosen for like the future class, like the day after I was made redundant, and like it's really like in parallel, all those feelings at once. No,
completely. And actually, Sony was a really good example where I literally had a job offer the next. In fact, I was on a call to a friend of mine within an hour. In fact, an hour before it was officially announced that we were being put at risk, I was up on a plane to Beijing a month later for the start of the first day of the next job. And that was a contracting job, so I could then do games. Now, again, this is really the other example. The other end of the spectrum was when my son had just been born, and I got made redundant from, I can't remember what the company is, where I was at the time now. But anyway, whatever company. Oh, I think it was Wireplay back in the day, the online gaming platform. It was called Gameplay, I think they were called at the time. Got made redundant from there, and literally my son was like 3 months old. Now, I didn't get a job for 3 months. Now, that's not a long time in the scheme of things, but I I had basically no money saved up. I had a new baby, blah 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 blah. In hindsight, it was the best thing that could have happened. I got to spend 3 months with my baby. Fantastic. But the fear, the anxiety, actually hasn't ever left me. And I think that's probably an important thing to mention as well, because it has it's a formative process, and how you deal with it and what support you do or don't get, I think, has a formative effect on people's behaviour. Sorry, I'm going on again, but
No, I think it's important to talk about how it affects people and how they can best try and deal with it, or at least know that they're not alone in how they feel.
Exactly, yeah. And I think your description of grief is perfect. I think it is a grief. Have you ever been on the other side of the fence?
No, not really. I've always been like full time in the same company, and although I was in a leadership position, I've never had to let anyone go. I can't imagine how hard that is, though.
It's really hard. I had a particular one where I had to let a friend of mine go, and they were having difficulties. And in fact, I'm not sure if that makes it worse or better. And the trouble is, when you have to do that, you have to do it because it's necessary for the company. It's heartbreaking on a personal level as well. But you also lose that person as a friend, because no matter how good the relationship would have been, to let someone go like that is a massive hit to them. And that doesn't diminish. I mean, it's not the only time I've had to let people go. I had to let someone go recently, and it's like, you feel, you as a manager feel complete failure. And even though you know you've done everything behind the scenes to try to stop that from happening, at the end of the day, when a project ends, in fact, actually, I do want. We should get into this later, not now, but later. Let's talk about the way that we employ people in games, because I think there's some interesting areas to dive into on that.
Yeah. Well, let's first look at what's actually happened, because the layoffs has kind of happened over the last year-ish, and I think the number's probably around 18k officially as of this month, but that's just like what we know about. I'm sure there's so many things not being reported on that are happening in tandem with that. But I mean, I'm still quite young, so I haven't really been in the industry long enough to see if this happens regularly, if there's waves of things like that. Like, what's your perspective on that?
Well, obviously I'm old, as you know, but
I didn't say that.
But I mean, I've been around in the industry since '98, but I got in when I was 27, so I started quite late. Well, I say quite late, relatively. I actually did my first game pitch in 1987. I was 18 at the time, and I was told, great idea, come back when you've made it.
I don't need you when I've made it.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I suppose I'd say that story because I think it just reminds people that this is the same thing we still experience. But like that, the 80s in particular had a massive hit, particularly the UK games industry. So we were we were the single place that was most important for games, arguably. Yeah, other people say it was Japan, other people say it was US, and they were probably all right. But we were massively important at that particular point in time as an industry. We had a big collapse at that point. I think beyond that, I think we've seen. I think somebody referred to it as a 7 or 9 year cycle, because we do have peaks and troughs, and our cycle, I think, has historically been tied to the console cycle. But what that means is it's not quite matching, but if you look at some of the games projects, I think the amount of people we now have to make a AAA game is enormous. I mean, hundreds of people. Once that game hits the point where it turns from a product development process to a live operations process, and all games do that, so don't pretend otherwise. Even if you think you've got a product, you are still going to do a live ops like process to manage the experience post release. And some games have large teams doing that, some games have small teams doing that. Well, if you've had a large, massively huge team doing it, and then you're going to go to a small team, there is going to be a change. And if the project start and the next project start doesn't match, and they never do, more or less, because you know, where am I going to get the budget from? How do I know the game's going to sell? Blah blah blah. Of course, we have these cycles, and when they align, then we have these massive kind of culling moments. But it's interesting. I think this one. We'll talk a little bit about what I think might be going on. That's more than just the surface later, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, cycles have been continuous. There's always been a situation where we have these peaks and troughs, these hyper excitements and lower levels, but they tend to be about platform releases. And I think this is probably the first, maybe the second massive mobile driven one as well, because I think that's a massive factor in this as well. It's not just about PC, but I think the overburn in the mobile during COVID has probably had a particular effect. And I have thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's natural for like most games companies to scale up and down during production, and there'll always be a real rush before release to hit the deadline, especially if they've announced a release date and things like that.
It's not like games industry would have lots of people locked into a room, unable to leave the building for months on end. I mean, who'd do that?
There's pizza and blankets as well.
It's fine. Honestly, I still despair. And I know I kind of witter on about it, but this is why I like live ops more, because you can't do that with live ops. Because if you burn your team out and then you make them all redundant, how on earth are you going to manage it? You can't. You physically can't do that. So anyway, I look at my
crunch culture is a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. But I think it's related. I honestly think this is related. I think.
Yeah. No.
I think the attitude of crunch culture, and I know I was being a bit generous earlier, but there has been an attitude of crunch culture, and I think that reflects in redundancy cycles. But maybe I'm being mean. I don't know.
Do you think that there's one singular more contributing factor to the layoffs? Like, if you had to pick one that was the biggest thing that might have caused it?
I don't believe in one reason. I think there are multiple, and I'm going to be controversial and say it comes down to Apple removing IDFA.
I don't even know anything about that, so why don't you tell us?
So again, please stop me from doing my usual diatribe, but bear with me on this logic. Okay, so Apple remove the ID for advertisers. Why does that matter? Well, it's because it's about privacy. Why does that matter? Well, because privacy means that Apple users are presented with the option to agree to having third parties having access to their data. We're all very good and wonderful. However, the way they implemented it, I would argue, was a little bit kind of naughty. Well, maybe not naughty, but I'm not hugely a fan of it. For example, if you use an Apple app, it says, hey, we can improve your experience if we use your data. But generally, if you have a third-party app, it says, watch out, this is dangerous, so third parties will have access to your data. Which one of those two are you going to say yes to?
Yeah, I know.
Now, why does that matter in the big scheme of things? How is that going to affect PC games? How is it going to affect console games? Well, what that effect of that is because a lot of the data analytics about behaviour, about what general public behaviour is going to be tied up in a massive way to the Apple audience. It's a huge component, not the whole of it, it's not half of it, but it's pretty solid amount of users. And I'm not talking about kind of like, you know, disturbing information. I'm not talking about like silly stuff, right? You know, where that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about normal marketing insight, information about what people like and do as a group, as a large audience, not as an individual. I'm not interested in chasing individual data. I don't think it's that useful, to be honest. Well, it has its uses. But then I'm ethical in the use of data. So what I want to know is what are the trends, the patterns, and so on and so forth. And I can't get that information if a massive chunk of the audience isn't there, because what happens is the rest of the information over biases what your insights are telling you. So that's had an effect where Facebook ads, not just for games but for others, so Meta hasn't been quite as effective as it would have been. Don't get me wrong, it's still fine. I'm not having a go at Apple, I'm not having a go at Facebook, I'm just saying there's a consequence to some of these behaviours. So that means that we now have a situation where I, as a person trying to promote a game, whether it's on PC or on mobile, using a social platform, don't have the accuracy we used to have.
So what's the impact of that? Is it that you can't predict?
It's partly that you can't predict.
Games?
It's also that it becomes more expensive.
Right.
So I have to spend more money to acquire users, directly and indirectly. Even when I'm using social media, even when I'm working with streamers, all this stuff, because there's less information, the level of detail is lower. So that means that it's more expensive. What happens if it's more expensive to make money on a game? We make less profit. So there's less money to reinvest. There's less money to pay people. Then take that to the next extreme. So that's one thing. That's thing one. Now chuck in that we have an economic crisis going on. We've had one basically going on since 2008, but let's ignore that. I'm not going to get into politics, however much I might be tempted. But we haven't had the best banking circumstances. There has been, particularly in the last 2 years, post-COVID, basically, have had the Ukraine and Israel situation. That's been a pretty massive hit on the willingness of people to spend. At the same time, we now have interest rates that are actually not terrible. So if you've got a bunch of money, you can see all the stuff that's not making as much money as it used to. Well, why don't I just put it into a bank account? So there's a reduction in the amount of investment, and then you've got the lack of the increased cost of acquisition. In order to get more players, you've got to spend even more money, and therefore it's less cost effective. And then the more people spend more money, the harder it is for smaller devs to be able to acquire users. So hopefully I'm painting a picture here. There's a lot of different threads that form together into this. Now, why did this not happen over COVID?
Well, as we know, there was a huge boom in gaming because everyone was stuck at home playing games, right?
Huge boom. And so we didn't notice the impact of the IDFA data stuff as much because it was compensated for. So what happens if you have this hot burning market, and then the reality of the hot burning market's issues are writ large as people change their behaviours and go back to normal? We think we're seeing a massive decline in industry, and we are seeing a constriction, but I don't think
it's not necessarily on a similar scale to what we're seeing in terms of layoffs.
Yes.
Or that's my perspective.
That's my point.
Like, it feels like my opinion is that potentially everyone's done quite well over COVID in terms of people are buying games, they're playing games, and a logical person would think that's not going to continue once the lockdown lifts and people will like slowly release back out into the world and they're touching the grass and stuff like that. They're not going to be at home on their console as much. So you would think you might logically predict your projections it's not going to follow that trajectory, but I suspect in some cases the developers or people looking to get more investors or shareholders would maybe use that as a model to show that it would at least sustain or carry on, which is not realistic, and then having to redo those figures later when you've got the actual data, which is not carried on.
Yeah, if you don't have a hockey stick graph on your revenue, you don't get the investment. I mean, so maybe I'm a bit lucky that we get asked by investors to kind of like check games. So I get the chance to basically try and be a bit more realistic. I can't be perfectly realistic because I don't know, and I want to be optimistic about the game. Obviously, but it doesn't make us. Well, I don't think it doesn't lose us friends, but it doesn't make us friends because we tell people how we think the game really works or not. But it's interesting, kind of trying to do that because not that many people know how to build a business model, and if you're going to build a business model, you're going to build it off data. If you're going to build it off the last few years of data, well, you've got a big COVID peak to deal with.
Yeah.
So that's tricky.
So yeah, it is. Do you think that Brexit had any impact? I know it's an old topic now, but I was like, no one's really talked about that much.
No, I'll never get tired about that. I absolutely think for the UK's situation, absolutely. Now, we are in a global market, so we maybe don't necessarily have the same level of impact as other industries. But given that we now have to pay customs charges on deliveries that come to us, given that we now can't hire people like we could, we have a massive skill shortage. No, shortage is probably too strong a word, but definitely a limitation on skills. In particular, we don't have. This is another topic for another time. We don't have good models to train juniors into seniors, seniors into leads. And importantly, a lead is not the same as a senior. A lead has a job of management. That is a different skill. Anyway, I can bore people forever on that one. That is definitely another topic for another time.
You just have to note all of these subjects as we cross them.
God, I've got so many subjects I want to talk about. It's awesome. But yeah, I mean, does that make sense to you, though? I mean, that's kind of where I'm taking it.
Yeah, it makes sense, but I'm not sure how the mobile market, like how much of the games industry that makes up.
Well, we used to be, if I remember correctly, quite heavily dependent on EU folks in game development. If you look at Finland, they have a massive drive to have immigration. In fact, I can't remember who it was. I think maybe Ilkka Paninen. I'm not too sure. Recently went on record because there was a move in the Finnish parliament to restrict how long someone could stay in Finland between roles. And I mean, anyway, one of the main leaders of the mobile industry out there was really upset about that, and I think rightly so. We have similar problems here. You know, there are means to employ people who have skill sets, but now. What was the latest thing? They were trying to set at like 38,000, something like that a year.
Yeah, right. Like the minimum salary was more than my salary was, definitely. Yeah,
and that's I think many people in the games industry, particularly Yuki Tiger folks, I think made some strong comments about that. I think it got changed in the end, but it does highlight a massive issue, a massive disconnect. And Brexit just exacerbated those problems.
I guess it's worth mentioning as well for anyone experiencing layoffs is if you're here on a visa or you're anywhere on a visa, you're potentially going to have to leave pretty soon after being made redundant. And there's that everyone's going to be moving back around, and that's another loss of talent.
Exactly. And
in the same way.
Honestly, I think that's a massive risk as well. And if you think about the visa thing, so a small company like us, we can't afford to do all of the paperwork.
It's expensive, yeah.
It's not practical. So we're dependent on the on finding people who've already got their visa. So if there are some interesting visas out there, like exceptional talent visas, which gives you ability to work, regardless of the country you come from. But these are like lottery tickets. They're like rocking horse poo. They're hard to get hold of. But yeah, so I think Brexit-wise, that was the one that I think is difficult to sort of judge for us as an industry. But I've no doubt that it's a massive issue. Yeah, you can guess my voting.
I think one of the I know I'm not very very right wing at all. So there's the ongoing conflict as well in Ukraine.
I mean, this makes me.
What's that going on?
I mean, this makes me cry. I mean, and the number of friends of mine who, Ukrainian friends. I used to go to Kiev fairly regularly for an event called Casual Connect, and there's also another event, DevGam, which I actually didn't attend that often, but all the organisers I know, and it's the original organisers I know, and it's like heartbreaking when your friends, you see pictures of Kiev and you go, I was walking down that street, and I mean I haven't been since the war, and it's tragic. And then you look at Israel as well, and I've got friends on both sides of that particular situation in bunkers. And what? I mean, just don't have words for it, and you know, it just it's heartbreaking. And what I find really problematic is, with all of these things, the politics of the military action seems to take precedent over the politics of people dealing with genuine struggle. And you know, I find it very difficult when we are told to take sides. The only side I want to take is that people who are struggling. Anyway, the point, I suppose, is though, we have to sort of separate our humanity from that for the purpose of this conversation.
A little.
But what does that do what does that do to the market? Now, it means that people's priorities have changed. It's going to have a depressing impact. Usually, we would have assumed that the games industry, you know, I don't mean this in a bad way, but the games industry would usually thrive in situations like this because we're an escape. We're a relatively inexpensive escape. And if you think about 80% of the world's population play games in some form, I didn't just make that stat up. There was a stat somewhere that proved that one.
I believe it.
It sounds good, doesn't it? It sounds like a great... please insert citation. No, but there are... I mean, we know that people play games at a massive level, and we used to think we used to associate games playing with... When I was the 18-year-old in the dark, playing on the computer alone, I was also playing D&D and also having some amazing parties with heavy metal. But the point is, there was an association once upon a day that stuck with us. Gamers are geeks, and they're in the minority. About 80% of the people who've ever used Twitter, who are over 50, have used, define themselves as gamers. And I say that because I think TweetDeck did a survey on that very subject about 2 or 3 years before COVID. There's some great charts out there showing how broad it is, this audience, and yet I think we're scaring them off. Anyway, sorry, well, I can distract. Let me check another one at you. Another reason why this might be having an effect. Again, this is just a hypothesis at the moment. Think about the bad behaviour that's happened with, I'm not against loot crates in principle. I'm against monetization of loot crates. I think randomised joy is fine. Pseudo gambling like behaviour that is designed to manipulate people is not.
Yeah,
I think that's fairly obvious. If you add to that, like for example, at the moment, ad companies on mobile devices, and again, I like to think of all sides of games. I talk a lot about mobile because I think a lot of lessons from mobile are applicable across the board. A lot of lessons from PC are applicable across the board too. But look at the way ads done in mobile games at the moment. There's a bunch of ad companies that are moving the cross around the screen and making you chase it. They're increasing the length of duration of the ad before you can actually get rid of it and get the reward you asked for. They're not necessarily delivering good experiences anymore. And that hurts me because I was the original guy telling people to do this stuff back in the early days of rewarded ads. And what I think that's doing, this combination of bad acting, the poor versions of live ops that are pretending to be live ops when they're really just denying the content that should have been in the original release, that kind of thing, that kind of bad behaviour, I think it's put a lot of players off. I don't want to say existential crisis, but I think there's some really serious bad behaviours that are having an effect on all of us in the industry because of a minority who don't necessarily have the players' best interests at heart.
And what do you think about the rumours that the layoffs are potentially linked to AI? It's like some people are saying it's making way for AI to do our jobs, and I sort of personally think, I don't think you even can do my job with AI, but I guess there's also linked to the thing about mobile is that they're kind of doing AI-driven ads and stuff like that, and again, that's not necessarily responsible and things like that.
Well, I mean, I was trying to use AI to make a logo for myself. Why am I doing that? Because I'm not an artist.
Yeah.
AI is amazing. AI can make me present my ideas in a not terrible way. But the moment I try to do something a little bit outside the boundaries, it's awful. So I like to call it the uncanny valley. There's an uncanny valley.
I don't know if it's even there yet. Yeah.
No, but you know what I mean. It's like, I mean, obviously the 6 fingers, the 3 hands, whatever. There are lots.
Yeah.
I was trying to make
weird amounts of teeth.
Weird amounts of teeth. I mean,
too many.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I love AI as an idea, as an experience. It's fantastic. It's amazing. And like I say, I'm experimenting with other things for myself as a tool.
Yeah.
But the stuff I will make with it in this decade, at least, is conceptual. And don't get me wrong, I've used it to help speed up my artistic process, as in writing. Absolutely. I'll be writing like game narrative elements, but it's my concept. I'm just getting it to fill it out, and then I'm rewriting it once it's provided it. It just speeds the process up. That's it. It just speeds the process up.
Yeah, I'm not sure of many jobs in the industry currently that could really even be possibly replaced by AI. I really don't. And so there's no reason why anyone would make layoffs right now to try and replace them with an AI. Like, maybe in the future when it's very sophisticated, we'll see. But I don't think that's really an argument.
I think it's the opposite. I think it just means that the ability to produce material, which we can consume almost endlessly, just goes up. You know, it's a force multiplier. If it's used right, it'll be a force multiplier.
Right.
And I think, don't get me wrong, I think some people will lose their jobs over it, but in like 5-10 years time probably. But there'll be the people who don't absorb what's the potential of it, rather than, there's always a cycle. And I don't know about you, but for me, I'm having to update my skill set on a daily basis now.
Yeah, game designers, game developers, anyone who works in games, you're constantly adapting and evolving with new technology. So I don't think the introduction of AI is really any different for us in terms of that.
We're not lacking a need for artists to create new stuff. We're not lacking a need for coders to make new stuff. And all the, it's a language model that predicts. It's not going to create proper create.
And I think people get caught up in the scaremongering around it, and it's equally, a lot of that's only related to generative AI, which is a specific type of AI, rather than like artificial intelligence in general, which may be something that just tells like the baddie in a game you're playing how to attack you, or the little villagers how they're going to walk around. But that's not problematic.
Generative AI in games, I can't wait to have a proper conversation. I mean, I don't know. So there's a team I'm an advisor for called Atom Stars, and they made this. It's actually intended for, they're a games company, but they've done this for like a shopping console, like you're ordering your McDonald's, but instead of that, a face turns up and you talk to them. And the particular example I saw was Henry Ford. Okay, so imagine someone's done a 3D model using MetaHuman to make a lookalike for Henry Ford, and they're using a Henry Ford language model, so he responds like you're talking to Henry Ford. I had a discussion with this thing over whether you feel the employee should get paid well or not. And the reason is, he has a point. He historically talked about how important it was his staff could afford the cars.
So they were able to model that. So they're
able to model that, and he had it's a little slow, but compared to handcrafted narrative, honestly, it was amazing. The flex. It's not that don't get me wrong, I'm not dissing any writer. There are some amazing writers out there, and we have emotional journeys with writing in games, absolutely. But they can adapt, and if you have a framework where an amazing writer is supplemented by this kind of AI, we can make experiences you couldn't dream of 10 years ago.
I think there is a positive attitude to have towards these things, and you can kind of look towards a sort of utopia version of what we live in.
This another topic.
Or you can look at the dystopia. Yeah. It's up to you. Yeah, okay, let's not get sidetracked.
We will get sidetracked. And this is the point of this, is it's that maybe we should call it a little sidetrack, this thing, because I think, I think we should be joyful and responsible in these conversations. Yeah, totally. So generally, I'm sure there will be some, but I think in general it's a red herring. Are we looking at Skylab? No, we're not there yet. There's no consciousness here. There is no intelligence here. It is merely a tool. It's an amazing tool. It's stunning. It's glorious in so many interesting ways. I can't wait to see how I can make my job easier with it. I already am seeing it. That's
the goal, right? Yeah. Anyway, let's come back to layoffs. Let's look at what happens when you're laid off, because there might be people who have never been laid off, or people may have varying experiences. So let's share our own stories a little bit, or like, what was that like for you and what happened?
We could probably talk a bit about the process if it's done officially. And important caveat, I'm not an HR officer, but I have had to do the job, and not the HR job, but the role of letting someone go. Fortunately, most of the time I have help. There's either an HR department, or I have my very, very capable business partner who helps me make sure I don't do stupid things. So starts off, you've normally got to give someone notice. Now it depends on whether they're being made redundant or if you are going on a consultancy process. The consultancy process is generally where the company is of a particular size, I think. And I think the legislation requires, if you're a company of a certain size, or laying off a certain proportion of the audience. God, I'm a game designer. I can't help myself say audience. A certain proportion of the team. I think that's when the consultancy thing happens. Consultancy, typically you would have a period of time that's set. I think it's not uncommon. It's a month, where you are under notice that you might be at risk or not, and ideally the company's supposed to give you lots of support in that process. Not all do, but generally you're supposed to.
In your experience, is this them selecting a pool of people, and there'll be, say, 100 people in the pool and 50 will be laid off? Is that usually what happens in that?
I think in my experience it's a little bit less direct than that. In practice, you probably have a pretty good idea who's going to have to go. But it's not fair to just act that way. And so what you do is, instinctively roughly what's likely to happen, but you have to tell the whole department equally, and then you need to make sure that you've got good justification for that process. Because at the end of the day, you're making a very difficult decision that's going to have an impact on the whole operation of the business. People going does not make things easier. I mean, don't get me wrong, as a manager, the less people you have on your team, the slightly easier your day job is. But remember, you've got a lot of people who are probably distraught, and survivor guilt is real.
Yeah.
So that's why I think if you are a responsible company and you take that consultancy period seriously, it can be great. But it's only possible if the company is of a certain size.
Yeah, I found in UK law, basically, you have to not make predetermined decisions about who's going to go, but I don't think that's necessarily how it works, but you'd have to prove that you've not.
But that's what I'm saying, there's a fine line between you kind of know.
Yeah.
Because, the only reason you wouldn't kind of know is if you didn't know your company at all properly. So a responsible manager should know roughly what's likely to be needed to be done. But the important distinction there is you're making a clear decision on fact, not emotion. And that means you can't, kind of doesn't mean anything. The reality is, at some point you're going to go, right, this is what we're going to have to do, this is what the structure is, these are the compromises we're going to have to make, and frankly, you've got to be responsible in that process entirely.
How much information did you find on either side of the fence was actually shared with employees? Was it quite limited?
It can be quite limited, yeah. I mean, it kind of has to be. You need to be given the facts of what the situation is, but it is going to be very PR version of the facts, and that's not. It probably does feel unfair if you're on the receiving end, but you have to bear in mind that a company that's making a high number of redundancies like that is typically going to have to deal with a PR backlash. They're going to lose confidence in their investors. They've got to do something about that. And also, if they are a publicly traded or if they're a consumer-facing brand, there's a risk of having a long-term toxic feedback loop going on there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, let's not forget that in the equation. It's an important factor, but if you can't and shouldn't and must not mislead people in the process. That's basically, I've always been in the situation where when I've been on the receiving end, it's been clear. A couple of times, one particular time, you could argue, that wasn't really done right. But in the scheme of things, generally, I've been very lucky.
I think a lot of the bigger companies, if they've done it before as well, they know what they're doing and they're not gonna throw themselves into any tribunals too quickly.
And they'll know the legislation. They'll deal with the legislation accordingly. I mean, like I say, with a smaller company, or if a particular specific role is being made redundant, like for example, we had a situation where a particular project was ended, so we had particular people we had to let go, and that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we're back to the freelance versus full-time employee. Do we operate as a organisation with a long-term strategy, or do we have a bunch of projects which dovetail? There are genuine questions about how we operate as a business in general. But anyway, the point being is that you can, if somebody is specifically and their role is no longer required, you can go straight to redundancy in those circumstances if your company is relatively small. And again, I think that's a kindness. I don't.
Yeah, I think for me, the process dragged on for quite a long time and it was indeterminate.
Yeah.
And I think I would have almost been happier if they just pulled the plug rather than me trying to fight for some pretend role that wasn't actually there, because they kind of make, I think by law they have to either look for alternative roles for you within the company or like help you with that. And ultimately, if you're in a small company or you're in a big company that's making layoffs, there's not even other roles you could pitch for because they're trying to save money. So that whole process is a little bit fake, I think. But they have to do it. But
and you can't. You have to make a role redundant, not a person. I think that's the way it works. And that means if they just change the name of the role, that doesn't count. That's not appropriate. Anyway, so again, this is the thing about UK law versus UK regulation. Not that we're lawyers, not that we're HR people. So if we're wrong, please tell us. We're very happy to be corrected. But I don't know how it works in the US in particular. I think that's a little bit less easy for the employee, I suspect. But yeah, so I mean, I think typically then when you get a letter of notice that confirms the status of your contract terms, usually, and in fact, one of the things I would always recommend you do, if you've got a copy of your employment contract, which you should have somewhere, read it.
Absolutely.
Because you may have rights in there you are not getting, and you should. But equally, you might be thinking you have rights you don't have.
Yeah.
I think that's in some ways the worst one, is where people haven't read the terms and there is a clause in there which is not necessarily unreasonable, might be completely reasonable, but you didn't think that was the case. And the lack of knowledge can be the hardest thing there.
Yeah, it's really tricky because when you're signing on for a new company, the last thing you're thinking about when you're reading your contract is what are the clauses in here about if I get laid off.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're excited with the new role and but termination?
Yeah.
That's a horrible word as it is, but I mean, that's as I often say in podcasts, I'm a big believer in the Mythbusters, and failure is always an option.
I think one of the things I found with redundancy is a lot of people view it like it's a one-sided conversation. They're going, your job's done, that's it.
Yeah.
But I think one of my friends said to me, it's a negotiation. You can still talk to them, and whatever they offer initially, depending on if they're offering a settlement or if it's just a notice period, you can still talk to them and negotiate that. Or it may be things like, can I keep my private healthcare for another month after, just while I find another job? Or can I keep my equipment that will help me turn to freelance? Whatever it may be, everyone will have their own individual circumstances that they can negotiate on and go in it, because they're treating you like a business decision. Treat them like a business decision as well, and do that.
It's interesting though. I mean, one of the difficulties you can have though is some people won't fulfill their side of the contract, because when you are being made redundant, you're under notice, you are still supposed to work. You are still, your pay at the end of that period of time is dependent on you completing the tasks assigned to you. And a lot of, so again, the kind of counterpoint of the employer's responsibility is also the employee's responsibility, and it's emotionally difficult to do that sometimes, and you want to focus on getting a new job, obviously. But if you want that paycheck at the end of that month, that paycheck is in return for you working, and that sounds really mean of me to say it, but it is the case. That being said, I would usually try to give people gardening leave. And there are some roles where you have to. In fact, there's some roles you have to get someone shut off immediately, because whilst they might be lovely people, you never know who might decide to act in a fit of pique in a way that could be detrimental. So well, you've just pulled the rug out of their entire life. Like, even if they might be fine in a week, right now they're feeling angry and they might want to sabotage everything. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And so, this is another thing as an employer you have to pay attention to. What passwords do they have access to? What's your backup plan? What if they don't do their handover notes? And handover notes is something you'd expect somebody to need to do. And do responsibly, and we've had situations, or I've had situations in the past where people haven't done their handover notes. They haven't done the thing that they were asked to do that they said they would do the month before, and that puts the business at even more risk. So it's a difficult one, and I don't want to kind of be overly dramatic about it, but like you say, it is a conversation. It's a conversation worth having. Often the employer won't have much choice about what's going on, but they might have, and there might be other things they can do. I mean, for me, I've always said to people, I will do everything I can. If they need introductions to people, if I can't do that, what's the point of me? Basically. But there's only so much you can do. You want to give people as much space as possible, and we've got to give them the space to find a job. But at the same time, I think we do. This is going to sound mean. We deserve the respect to be able to get the work that you're contracted to do done.
I think it's very circumstantial. Like, if you're having a project cut, there's no point carrying on with something that's not going to exist in those kind of situations. But
exactly.
I don't know. It's very circumstantial. It's different for everyone, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
But it's totally fair to expect someone to work a job that you're paying them to do. But you equally, I think you have to give them maybe 2 days of extra leave to prepare for stuff and things like that. I don't
remember the details of it, but I think the bottom line is, as an employer and as an employee, it's just to basically let's try to close this as neatly as possible. Because do you know what? Who knows where you're going to end up? I still am in touch with people
Absolutely.
that people I was a boss of like 20 years ago that I still talk to. And some of them are amazing. So one person who actually got made redundant with me when I was at Sony is now this amazing superstar, running community management for a big company, and I think that's maybe the thing I think we ought to also move on to, which is, it might seem like bad times, and it is for now, but the amount of benefit that comes having had that experience and then moving on to a new place with the benefit of that experience as your starting point, I think that's amazing. And I've actually had, in every situation I've been made redundant, I've come out better. Now, I don't think that's just me. I'm very happy to accept there might be survivor circumstance, but
yeah,
the opportunity for people to turn these things around. If you're in games, you're probably relatively skilled. You probably gained a lot of information about the process of developing the game you worked on and the teams you've worked with. And we're a small industry.
It's exactly that. It's such a small industry, people will move around. Like, it's rare for someone to spend 50 years at one company, and some of the people who may be on the other side of your redundancy, if you know they're genuine good people, then it's like handling the process in like a mature and trying to remove some of the emotion away from it, and like dealing with each other as people, I think helps, because you may be the other way around next time, or you'd be working together at another thing, or they may be someone who could have hooked you up with a new contact or job, and they may not now because you've been a dick.
Yeah, exactly. My first name being Richard, I learned very early on not to be a dick. So sorry, bad joke.
Very good.
Also
very
true.
Good.
Anyway, but just taking about, I think that's really at the end of this. It's like, and this is why I kind of was hinting at earlier. I think maybe we have a problem in the way we address employment in games. I don't know what the right answer is, but I feel like we have a lot of games that have at the heart of it a massive project element, and some of them then have a live operated element. And the needs of the project development side are not the same as the needs of the live ops side. And I don't think we've found a good balance for making that work. Traditional employment, the idea of a job for life you said it earlier, doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we should be feeling like we're discardable.
Yeah.
And how do we find a way to make that process a bit better? I don't know if there's an answer. I just feel like there's, we have this massive opportunity. We're going to have loads of people out there who've got, some of whom have got redundancy money, who are going to go and have these brand new interesting ideas, who are going to be able to set up brand new interesting companies. A lot of them are going to go bust, and that's natural. But how do we stop that from just being a down? How do we make that so we're investing in the industry as a whole, where those games that can change the world do change the world? Because let's face it, let's take one of the earlier downs. So Nokia made a load of people redundant in Finland around the same sort of time that the idea of making games on Java devices started to become interesting. And that's where you get people like Ilkka Paananen, and that's where you get people like at the time there's a company called Digital Chocolate. There are a whole bunch of teams out there who have come out of it. So not just Digital Chocolate, that's also Ilkka. I'm thinking about Mr. Good Living was the one I'm thinking of. So folks like Nitro Games, folks like Hill Climb Race, folks like obviously Supercell, Rovio. That whole Finnish industry is riddled with people who come out of that proving ground that kicked out of this period of time where Nokia were changing around. They invested in a lot of funding. They realised that mobile content was interesting. The Finnish system had a whole bunch of benefits. And it's not just Finland. We've had this happen for us in other parts of this industry. We see these cycles where a negative period gives the creative potential for something to explode out of it.
Yeah, I think people talk a lot about potentially making games or products from a data-driven perspective, but I think you're only looking at the data of stuff that already exists. It means you're not actually doing anything new, right? And
we need to do this as the podcast. This will be fun.
Yeah, another thing.
Because I'm a data lover, but
yeah.
I do. You're right too.
But you need both, right? You can't be in one or the other.
Yeah.
But yeah, the great thing about like redundancies generally is you probably will get a level of pay. How long that is dependent. I think Epic Games gave everyone 6 months of pay, and it's like that's quite a good runway. And it may be like in the UK, for example, ours is usually gross pay, so we're not taxed on our redundancy pay, and so it actually you might survive for a little bit longer than that, and so that's quite a good time if you were so inclined.
I think it's just
to make a good demo to pitch to publishers,
not the notice part. But I don't remember the details. I'm not.
No, you're right. Yeah. So there's the redundancy pay, then your notice period is your normal pay, and then whatever settlement you get is also all tax free. Up to 30k or something.
Yeah, and I forgot what it is, but I think it's for each full year. Importantly, full year, you get a week's pay essentially in terms of redundancy, which is okay. Not amazing, but it's okay. But some companies can pay above and beyond, and the bigger companies can and do, because and why they do that is there's benefits in doing that for lots of reasons.
I think there's kind of two prongs to that, because for us it's potentially good because we've got time to either find another job or make a game, whatever it may be, but it's also hugely expensive for these companies to make this level of layoffs, and so they're losing quite a lot of money doing it, and I don't know if they're necessarily going to recoup that. They just have to do it to make the financial reports look better in the meantime.
Well, it's all to do with run rate, because if your burn rate is that high,
right,
being able to sustain the long term status of the company, and so it's actually
there's like an end to when they're spending that, right? Yeah.
So the net effect is, well, they would have been spending this money, but they just have this skills gap in that process. It's like almost like it's like the braking distance, if that makes sense.
So, I get it.
But
it's I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing unless you really, really need to, because like you say, there's survivor guilt left over, and there's going to be really low morale amongst everybody, especially in this period in the industry, because you're seeing all your friends go through it. Like your news feeds are constantly full of this. I think we're almost in a better position being laid off because we're not sat there worrying that we're going to be next.
I think if anything, I'm a bit concerned that for some companies it's a good time to make layoffs.
There's definitely a, like, when your friends have babies and then everyone around them starts having kids.
Oh yeah. That I know. Well, it's been a while. but the point I suppose is that we will never know which of these companies did it because they had to versus those that did it because they had no choice. We will never know the number of small companies who cannot tell people publicly what happened because they don't have the stability to be able to do that, and I think it's good for them not to have to tell people, because at the end of the day it puts everybody else's job in that company at risk if you do. And that's the tough part of being on the other side of the fence is sometimes you have to make a call whether you give up everybody or not, and that's a tough call.
It's very tricky with settlements, because if you don't know, most people probably sign basically a gagging order, so you won't talk about the process, you won't talk about the company in at all and what's happened for your payout, basically. And majority of people need that money to survive, so they're going to sign it. But then that's why you don't hear about a lot of the situations, is because everyone's sworn to secrecy by their money.
Exactly.
But I don't know, I think in some ways it would be good if other colleagues could actually hear from you, because I felt like the process was very isolating and I couldn't talk about it during the process and I couldn't really talk about it after, and so I feel like I lost a lot of friends through that.
That's actually,
and it would have
huge.
Been nice.
I think this is why I think it's so important to have solid groups of game developers that you work with and you connect with and you talk to. That's why I love things like Game Dev London as a principle, because
Absolutely.
The more we talk to each other, the more we share with each other, the easier it is. And we can, in that context, share not necessarily private details, but the journeys we're going through. And I think there's an interesting kind of it's like it's difficult to find the balancing act, because as you said, no one wants to be a dick, and we can't know all of what's going on for the managers and we can't know all that's going on for the employees or former employees. We just have to try and be human about it, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure lots of people probably feel the loss on both sides of the fence of colleagues that have been made redundant and colleagues that have been made redundant. But the really cool thing about the games industry is we have such a wonderful community, and whether it's online or in person, I think a lot of people, even for me, were very supportive. And even though I can't talk about stuff, I can at least people are like, are you okay?
Yeah.
you can talk about how it affects you,
mental health,
even if it's not
details.
details.
Massively important. But let's try and, again, I think it's important to think of the positive side of it. Is one of the things about a clean break, well, even if you don't get a massive payoff, one of the things about a clean break is you have a clean break, and there is a chance to do something new and exciting. And there's something that happens when you see the mindset of somebody who starts talking about the next project, and that is something magical. So yes, it is terrible, and we want to remember the human side of it. I'm not going to dismiss that anyway at all, and let's make sure we look after each other and deal with the mental health side of it. But let's also think, hang on a minute, what can we do with this? And I always think of it as it's a bit like Neverland. Whereas Neverland, it's second star to the right and straight home till morning. So the future is never a destination, it's always a direction. And that's, for me, what this is about. Is, yes, you've hit a rock, fine. What do we do about it? We can either sit on that rock, or we can take a new direction and get to the next thing, and who knows what we're going to discover.
I like that.
I think we probably should stop there, because we could carry on talking forever.
I think
so. But in summary, I think this has been your Game Dev London podcast, and we have been doing our yet to be named new format, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Tell us if you enjoyed it, and what do you think we should do about this? Are there ways we can continue the debate? Tell us what you think. And obviously, lots of different ways you can do that. We have the Game Dev London Discord, we have the various social media channels, and frankly, you can find me if you look on X. Yes, I'm still there. I don't know why.
It's Twitter, for God's sake.
Sorry, yes, Twitter. Yeah, sorry. So I'm still Athanasius on Twitter. I am Athanasius on most platforms. And Alex.
Well, I'm Alex Jones on most platforms, pretty much everywhere. Twitter I'm chronically still on as well, so that's the main place.
Yeah, and obviously please feel free to like, subscribe, share, all the usual juicy things. And so without further ado, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.